Lost Vikings has kind of an interesting story about how it got started. Game had come out called Lemmings, and so that's actually how Lost Vikings started. It started with the idea that it would be a console game, and you would control hundreds of little tiny Viking units with different abilities.
It was this game with hundreds of little tiny blonde-haired 8-pixel tall Vikings, and it was very similar to Lemmings. You would have torch Vikings, you would have ladder Vikings, and you would use these different type of Vikings to scale castles, cross modes, defeat enemies.
And we wanted to build a whole game around that motif where you're trying to conquer enemy towns. So in some ways, sort of like a 2D side-scrolling version of what Warcraft was.
And then eventually it evolved down to fewer Vikings, 5 Vikings, 3 Vikings, 3 Vikings each with very specific abilities.
And as we were prototyping it, we realized that on a TV, those little units didn't look very good. And then we started to kind of think about how players of console games like a little more direct control as opposed to indirect.
If we were going up against these big games, Mario, Sonic, games like that, we needed to have characters that compete with them. And hundreds of little Vikings couldn't do it. And when we all sat down and were playing it, we all saw this. It wasn't like one person had this idea and we went and decided to change it. Everyone was seeing it and going, this just doesn't feel right. It's too slow. We need to make this game a little bit faster, a little bit more fun. Our characters need to be characters that you can associate with, not 8 pixels of torch-bearing Viking.
And the technical challenges were pretty large, and we didn't really have a perfect design for it. You know, we were still exploring. And gradually the game morphed over time to become first 5 Vikings with individual skills that you would work through a level. And then later, because it turned out to be really time consuming to think about how to get 5 Vikings to move through a level, down to just the 3 that we see today.
As they worked on it, they just kept kind of more specializing and specializing the Vikings until they were actually just down to 3. And I think it kind of, that's kind of carried over into some of other Blizzard games where they've really kind of trying to concentrate, you know, the coolness in individual units and characters rather than just have tons of characters that are just the same.
It made it really interesting to move these 3 different characters through the same level or parts of the same level. They didn't necessarily traverse exactly the same paths. But even when they did, because their ability sets were so different, it still played very differently. And that was part of the sort of the magic in the design of the levels and the sort of approach to the puzzle solving was, depending on the character you were playing, the same level would play very differently. That made it kind of interesting.
One of the challenges for the game Vikings was that you had to get all 3 characters to the end of the level. And so that meant that there was potentially a lot of having characters move across the same ground. Like, you know, you solve the puzzle and then everybody has to walk forward. And our original conception for that was that there was going to be an auto-follow feature that would enable all the characters to follow one of them. Although the levels were so dangerous that, you know, if you had one of the characters die because it was doing an auto-follow, that would have been really annoying. And it ended up being a feature we just didn't have time for in any event. So generally the levels were really compressed in that a lot of the action happens in a very small space, so the Vikings didn't have to travel very far in order to get to the exits. You might have one that went, you know, really far out of his way, like Olaf flying around trying to avoid a bunch of spikes, but then he comes back to where the other characters are and opens a door so that then they can get out of the level.
I think the main appeal of Lost Vikings is the 3 different characters. And not only are they're cool little Viking characters doing things that you would expect Vikings to do, we took them through time. So you're playing Vikings in prehistoric times, in future times, in crazy, wacky levels where you have these various monsters that are like a hand bouncing a ball that throws itself. Like, we just had fun with the game. We explored all these different sort of eras, and we had our 3 familiar Vikings to guide us through it. So it was almost like we were taking tours of these different environments and living them through the 3 different characters.
I remember we're just having to brainstorm different ways that the Vikings could work together or do things on their own and what limitations they had when they were on their own, and just trying to come up with crazy situations. I think it was a willingness to try different things.
So as you went through the level, you had to use their skills differently or use whatever skill was appropriate for the area of the level you were in. So you'd see a problem and you'd say, which of the skills will be best here? Ooh, that's going to be Olaf because he has the shield, but then he's already locked on the other side of the map. So, and you had to figure out how to get them into the right places at the right times with the right powers. I liked that. I like that puzzle solving aspect of it. They needed whatever ideas that they could come up with, whatever we could come up with for creating levels or ideas for the characters to have special powers or anything like that. Because even the three Vikings, they didn't have all of their special powers known at the time that we were developing the levels. By the time I did my level, we did know what the powers would be. So I built the powers into my level to make sure that I'd have 3 different areas where each character would get to do something interesting.
We had done some mock-ups of what the Vikings should look like and stuff like that, and Brian Fargo at Interplay and them and Alan Pavlish and them looked at them and just didn't think that they were cutesy enough or lovable enough. So they had given one of their artists, Todd, the assignment to design the Vikings in a way that would make them adorable and make them really cool for the players. And he did a fantastic job, and I think that even to this day, I think that it was probably one of the best decisions that was made.
I remember Alan coming in and having this huge list of criticisms for the game, but I don't really remember it being very harsh. I just remember it being really, really thorough. And like, oh, here's somebody who really cares, you know, about this game. And, you know, any one suggestion on its own wouldn't make the game any better, but doing them all would, you know, turn the game from like, you know, a B quality game into an A game easily. Just having somebody thoroughly go through it from the outside, it was invaluable.
When I think back to Lost Vikings, probably the first thing that comes to mind for me is the graphics, the vibrant, colorful graphics. I think because it was a Nintendo game, and if you think about the other console games at the time, things like Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario, they were so vibrantly neon colored. We went that direction too, and so the colors really pop when I think about, you know, in my mind's eye what Lost Vikings was. And that's another one of those lessons that even, you know, many, many years later, you still see those sort of approach colorful, vibrant backgrounds in the games today. And, you know, Overwatch is a great example of a beautiful, vibrant, colorful world in a genre that's typically pretty sort of, you know, dusty and dark and gray.
Well, being that my first gig, my first task for Blizzard was to convert the sound and music for Lost Vikings to PC format, I got exposed to it heavily, and I mean, it was a new job, so I didn't question it, but yeah, when I took a step back and thought about it, like, why are these Lost Vikings in space? And I guess as the story unfolds, it explains why that happened, although it's still a little bit far-fetched. I don't know who came up with that idea, but yeah, it sounds like an artist idea.
As far as the design for Lost Vikings, the backgrounds and stuff like that, we literally were just, what would be fun? What would meet the Super Nintendo's audience as to what would be quirky, what would stand out, and we were trying to come up with an idea as to how we could get them in these different environments that didn't make any sense. So at the time, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on about alien abductions, so we had them abducted by an alien, and it was pretty funny because then we could take them and drop them into anywhere. So we could drop them into a factory zone, we could drop them into the goofy world, we could drop them into just about anywhere and everywhere, and we had designs for all kinds of things. So it was all pretty much dependent on what kind of artwork we can draw and stuff like that. So we started doing a lot of artwork. Part of my job at the time was also to take all that artwork and convert it into something that's usable on the Super Nintendo. So those digital limitations for that, as well as making sure that they fit within the color palettes for how Super Nintendo and the Sega systems were laid out, it was a very mind-racking existence that continued on into Warcraft 1, because I used that to lay out all the levels in Warcraft 1 as well.
So when I think back to Lost Vikings, there's a story in particular that helped sort of form Blizzard's design philosophies. We had just come out with it. We had heard that there was a Virgin Megastore nearby that had a kiosk showing the game. So drove over there eagerly at lunch and saw there were actually 4 kiosks side by side showing different games, and Lost Vikings was one of them. And I got there just in time to see this boy, probably 13 or 14 years old, walk up and pick up the controller for Lost Vikings. It was the very first level. And the very first thing, one of the first things you have to do is you take Eric and you just move him a little bit to the right, and he has to jump over this pit of electricity and then open the door on the other side. And that's literally all you had to do. We're just trying to teach players how to jump with Eric. He picked up the controller, he took 2 steps to the right, fell into the electricity, put the controller down, and moved to the next game. And I just thought, oh my God, we killed this poor kid in the first 2 seconds of the game. He's never going to know what an amazing game this is. And so that lesson formed the basis of the philosophy that we use in everything we do now, which is making the onboarding of new players to the game as safe and easy as possible. You want your players right from the start to feel heroic and powerful and competent. And I hope that 14-year-old went back one day and tried a second time, but that lesson for me stands out as a watershed moment in Blizzard design philosophy.
Lost Vikings, it's funny because people that have played games a long time, you say Lost Vikings, a lot of people know what it is and have heard of it. They just don't know that Blizzard had anything to do with it. They don't know that we were Silicon and Synapse. So there was a lot of technical hurdles and things like that we had to overcome. My understanding from Alan, even though I didn't know it at the time, was that I always believed he knew technically what we needed to do and that he was leading us, but he admitted later, like many, many years later in an interview that he did, they were making it up for the most part because all the manuals that they had from Nintendo were in Japanese and they couldn't read them. And back then you didn't have online translations. So there were a lot of those kind of difficulties, but feeding off each other and helping each other, we're able to, as a team, come together to make a really good game in sometimes very difficult situations. There's just so many special moments in that game that makes me go back to it all the time and want to always call it my favorite game ever.